A severed head can remain conscious for up to 30 seconds after decapitation, a grotesque final half-minute where the eyes may blink, the lips attempt to speak, and awareness lingers as life fades. For Anne Boleyn, second wife of Henry VIII, and perhaps history's most famous beheaded queen, this horrifying possibility was just one facet of her execution. Contemporary accounts often distort the truth of her final moments, which reveal psychological torment far more disturbing than a mere sword stroke. It was a calculated political spectacle designed to obliterate not just her body, but her very legacy. Anne's execution stands as a testament to the brutal Tudor justice system, where death was merely the climax of a meticulously orchestrated humiliation. While many history books simply note she was beheaded for treason, the reality of her final days involved psychological dismantling so methodical it would unsettle even modern torturers. Her execution wasn't just an end, it was the final act of Henry VIII's campaign to erase a woman who had grown too powerful for his comfort. By May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn had endured 17 days imprisoned in the Tower of London, the same fortress where she had prepared for her coronation just 3 years earlier. Crowned Queen of England in an elaborate ceremony at Westminster Abbey, she now awaited death in a strange limbo, her fate repeatedly delayed as Henry cruelly prolonged her psychological agony. The king had even summoned an expert swordsman from Calais to perform the execution instead of using the traditional English axe, a detail often framed as mercy, but which only underscored the theatrical nature of what was to come. In her final hours, Anne displayed an almost supernatural calm, described by witnesses as cheerful, even as she prepared to die. Modern psychologists might recognize this as dissociation, a defense mechanism triggered by extreme trauma. She reportedly joked that she would be remembered as Anne sans tête, displaying a dark humor that masked her inner torment. Few historical accounts acknowledge the sheer terror she must have felt, knowing her reputation was being systematically destroyed through false accusations of adultery, incest, and plotting to murder the king. What makes Anne's execution uniquely harrowing isn't just the physical act of beheading, but the deliberate dismantling of her identity. Henry thus not only desired Anne's death, but sought to erase her from history, nullify her contributions, and delegitimize her daughter Elizabeth. The execution marked the climax of a smear campaign, crafted to justify to the English people why their once beloved queen deserved such a fate. In the days leading to her death, Anne was forced to listen to fabricated, lurid tales of her alleged sexual depravity. Accusations so absurd, any modern court would dismiss them. The morning of May 19th dawned unusually bright for London, a stark contrast to the grim events about to unfold. Anne had spent her final night in prayer, though sleep eluded her repeatedly. Tower records note she requested the sacrament at 2 a.m., kneeling before the something for hours in desperate communion. By dawn, she had been awake nearly 24 hours, her mind undoubtedly shattered by stress and exhaustion. When the lieutenant came for her, she was said to be laughing with her ladies, a reaction signaling not peace, but psychological collapse. Anne's execution had been scheduled and rescheduled multiple times, a form of psychological torture often overlooked. The uncertainty of not knowing precisely when death would arrive was a deliberate tactic against female prisoners. When finally informed the hour had come, Anne was led from her chambers through corridors where, barely 3 years earlier, she had processed as the future queen. Now, guards surrounded her, not out of respect, but to prevent escape. and the same courtiers who once bowed watched her final steps with calculated indifference. The scaffold erected on Tower Green was unusually low, barely a meter off the ground, unlike the towering platforms often depicted in films. This intentional design forced Anne to climb only a few steps, stripping her of the dignity height afforded and keeping her closer to the jeering crowd. While modern portrayals often show a solemn gathering, historical records suggest a carnival-like atmosphere was encouraged. The execution was, after all, a public spectacle, a warning to any who defied the king's authority, particularly women who dared overstep their station. Before kneeling at the block, Anne was permitted a final speech, not out of mercy, but because tradition demanded it. Her words, carefully, the actions revealed both her political insight and her desperate situation. "Good Christians, I have come here to die, for by the law and through the law, I am condemned to death, and thus I will say nothing against it." This seeming submission to her fate was, in truth, her final act of defiance. By acknowledging the law without admitting guilt, she subtly challenged the legitimacy of the charges against her. Perhaps most unsettling was the king's absence. Unlike the public spectacle of royal executions, Henry VIII did not attend. Instead, while waiting at Whitehall Palace for confirmation of Anne's death, he was said to be celebrating his impending marriage to Jane Seymour, a brutal testament to how thoroughly Anne had been cast aside. The personal had become political, and Anne's death was merely an inconvenient necessity in the king's pursuit of a male heir. The swordsman from Calais was specifically requested and paid a substantial sum. His skill represented another layer of calculated cruelty. Traditional English beheadings used an axe, often requiring multiple strikes to sever the head completely. The French swordsman, though more likely to achieve decapitation in one stroke, was unknown to Anne. In her final moments, she faced death at the hands of a stranger, a final humiliation for a queen who once held England's attention. The blindfold, often described as an act of mercy to spare her the sight of the sword, served a more practical purpose: to prevent her from flinching at the crucial moment, which could result in a botched execution. Anne knelt rather than placing her head on a block, another French tradition that heightened the executioner's challenge. This position forced her to remain still through sheer will, maintaining composure even as the swordsman prepared his strike. Witnesses reported her lips moving continuously in prayer, her gaze fixed beneath the blindfold, straining for any sound of the approaching blade. The psychological torment of this moment, knowing death was near but not when, represents a rarely acknowledged form of torture in sanitized historical accounts. The beheading itself was remarkably clean by Tudor standards. A single stroke severed Anne's head. Yet what followed is often omitted from polite historical narratives. According to witnesses, her eyes and lips continued moving for several seconds. After the beheading, a terrifying physiological response occurs when oxygen lingers in the brain tissue. Some accounts even suggest her lips formed words, perhaps continuing the sentence cut short by the sword's blow. The scene was so disturbing that several witnesses fainted, while others turned away in horror at this grim reminder of the fragile link between body and soul. Perhaps most revealing was the lack of a proper coffin for Anne's remains. Her ladies-in-waiting, overwhelmed by grief and horror, hastily searched for an arrow chest to place her head and body. This seemingly minor oversight speaks volumes about the utter disregard for Anne's dignity. Even in death, she was an afterthought, a political problem resolved rather than a human deserving basic funeral respect. She was hastily buried in an unmarked grave within the chapel of the Tower, without proper Christian rites, as if the king hoped her memory would fade as swiftly as her life had ended. Henry's determination to erase Anne extended beyond her death. Court painters were ordered to destroy her portraits. Her royal emblems were chiseled from palace walls. And courtiers soon learned that mentioning her name could invite royal disapproval. Often focus on the physical act of execution. This systematic erasure of Anne's very existence represents a violence that transcended her death, an attempt to execute not just a person, but a legacy. Centuries would pass before historians began the painstaking work of reconstructing Anne's life from fragments that survived Henry's purge. The execution also traumatized those forced to witness it, particularly her ladies-in-waiting, who had to clean and prepare her severed head before burial. These terrified women, fearing implication in the Queen's alleged crimes, performed this ghastly task while maintaining composure. Several reportedly suffered nightmares for years, and at least one eventually entered a convent, unable to continue court life after what she had witnessed. The psychological repercussions spread far beyond Anne herself, creating an atmosphere of fear that lingered in Henry's court for the rest of his reign. Immediately after the execution, Anne's daughter Elizabeth, not yet 3 years old, was declared illegitimate and removed from the line of succession. The girl who would one day become the most significant Queen of England was left nearly orphaned. Her mother was executed, and her father publicly denied her legitimacy. Court records reveal that Elizabeth suddenly found herself stripped of the attire and support befitting her former status. Her family dissolved almost overnight. This harsh treatment of a young child adds another layer to the horror surrounding Anne's execution. The punishment extended even to her innocent daughter. Most modern depictions of Tudor executions fail to capture the overwhelming sensory experience. The scaffold would have reeked of blood from previous executions, buzzing with flies in the May heat. The roar of the crowd, manipulated by infiltrated sympathizers instructed to cheer the Queen's death, created a wall of sound meant to disorient and terrify. Anne would have heard this cacophony grow louder as she approached Tower Green. The jeers and hisses encouraged the public to see her as a witch and adulteress. This carefully orchestrated public humiliation was a key part of Tudor justice. Death alone was never punishment enough. Popular culture often romanticizes Anne's final speech as a moment of dignified defiance. But historical records suggest a more nuanced reality. Her carefully crafted words, praising the king as a gentle and sovereign lord, reflect the impossible position she held even in the face of certain death. Anne could not speak freely. Her words were constrained by concern for her daughter's future and the watching crowd's reaction. Her speech was not an act of free expression, but the ultimate censorship of a woman who knew even her last words would be reported to the king and could impact those she left behind. The sword that ended Anne's life, specially imported from France, symbolizes the performative nature of her execution. Henry spared no expense to ensure a spectacle worthy of a queen's downfall. It is said the executioner practiced on animals beforehand, determined to deliver the clean strike that would earn him his hefty fee. This cold professionalism, reducing Anne's death to a technical challenge, exemplifies the dehumanization inherent in state-sanctioned execution. Anne was not merely killed, She was processed through a system designed to turn human suffering into political messaging. Contemporary accounts note that no English executioner would carry out the task, not out of moral objection, but because the French sword technique demanded specialized training. As the blade itself was exceptionally sharp and had a different weight compared to an English axe, it was crafted for a swift horizontal strike rather than the downward chop of an axe. This technical nuance highlights the theatrical nature of Anne's execution, where even the method was meticulously chosen for maximum effect and minimal mess, ensuring the spectacle proceeded without the undignified complications of a botched beheading. After the sword fell, witness Thomas Wyatt, imprisoned in the Tower and forced to watch the execution of a woman he once admired, wrote of the slender neck once adorned with jewels. His poetic lament captures the grotesque transformation of Anne from Dawn's queen to a lifeless corpse. The severed head was swiftly wrapped in linen by her weeping ladies, though not before the executioner raised it by the hair, a customary gesture to display justice served. This moment of exhibition, with blood still flowing from the severed arteries, became the defining image seared into witnesses' memories. Tower records indicate Anne's remains were buried so hastily that Christian funeral rites were nearly omitted. The chest holding her head and body was placed beneath the chapel floor, alongside other executed nobles, a dishonorable end for a crowned queen of England. No marker identified her grave, leaving its exact location unknown for centuries. This erasure of her final resting place marked the culmination of Henry's campaign to expunge Anne not just from life, but from history itself, a campaign that nearly succeeded. In the days following the execution, Henry's propagandists worked tirelessly to shape public perception. Court poets, who once praised Anne's wit and beauty, now penned verses condemning her as a scheming adulteress. Official accounts framed the king's mercy in providing a skilled swordsman over the traditional axe, recasting his theatrical choice as compassion. The horror of the execution was systematically scrubbed from records, initiating a historical revision that still distorts our understanding of Anne's final moments. Perhaps most unsettling to modern sensibilities is the speed with which her life, Enrique Bueno's life, returned to normal the day after Anna's execution. He formally committed to Jane Simmer just 2 weeks after sending his second wife to the scaffold. Enrique then married his third wife in a quiet ceremony at Whitehall Palace. This swift cruelty shows the execution was merely a convenient solution to a political problem. Anna had failed to produce a male heir, so she was removed and replaced. The personal tragedy of her death was entirely overshadowed by the demands of governance and dynasty building. The psychological toll of Anna's execution extended beyond the scaffold. In the weeks before her death, she endured relentless questioning, sleep deprivation, and isolation from her supporters. Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister, who devised the charges against her, used methods strikingly similar to modern psychological torture: disorientation, sleep deprivation, isolation, and strategic misinformation. By the time Anna reached the scaffold, she had already suffered a mental breakdown designed to ensure her final compliance. Court records reveal the extraordinary security measures taken for Anna's execution, far beyond what was usual even for high-ranking traitors. The Tower garrison was doubled, and special guards were stationed throughout the fortress. These precautions weren't meant to prevent escape, but to stop any supporters from staging a last-minute intervention or rallying public opposition. The overwhelming show of force also aimed to intimidate sympathizers into silently accepting the king's will. The execution was scheduled for mid-morning instead of the traditional dawn, allowing maximum attendance from Londoners. Tower Green could only hold a limited audience of nobles and officials, but the tower's height let the crowd outside hear the final announcement. Church bells across London then marked the moment of death, creating a city-wide acknowledgement of royal power. This orchestration turned Anna's private suffering into a public spectacle, political theater, rather than personal tragedy. Among the most overlooked aspects of Anna's execution was the fate of the other accused. 5 men, including her own brother George Boleyn, were executed days before her, charged with adultery involving the Queen. Their deaths were part of the same ruthless political purge. They helped clarify the facts of Anna's alleged crimes before her own execution, preventing any chance her final words might contradict the official narrative. This judicial killing of 6 people, all condemned with nearly identical false evidence, stands as one of the most brazen state acts of Tudor England. A purge comparable to Stalin's show trials centuries later. While Tower Green now bears a memorial marking the approximate site of Anna's execution, contemporary records suggest the actual scaffold stood elsewhere in the tower complex. This geographical confusion reflects how Anna's death has been repeatedly reshaped and relocated, both physically and historically, to serve different narratives. The romanticized version of her execution in popular culture bears little resemblance to the psychological warfare, slander, and calculated cruelty that defined her final days in May 1536. The horror of Anne Boleyn's execution lies not just in the physical act of beheading, but in understanding it as the culmination of an exhaustive campaign to destroy a woman who had risen too high for Tudor society's comfort. She was not merely executed, but systematically broken. Her reputation ruined, her achievements erased, her very existence nearly wiped from history. Memory reveals a far more disturbing horror than the swift stroke of a sword. From a modern psychological perspective, Anne's execution serves as a case study in state-sanctioned psychological manipulation and public defamation. The charges against her, ranging from adultery with multiple men, including her own brother, to conspiring to poison the king, were so absurd they would never hold in a modern court. Yet through careful manipulation of public opinion, strategic use of torture to extract confessions from co-accused, and control over all official accounts, Henry's government convinced many that Anne deserved her fate. This systematic distortion of reality may be the most horrifying aspect of her execution. 5 centuries later, Anne Boleyn's execution still captivates precisely because it represents the intersection of personal tragedy and political calculation. Her death was not merely the end of a life, but a carefully staged performance intended to justify a king's actions and reshape historical memory. The true horror lies not in the instant the sword fell, but in understanding how authority can completely rewrite reality. A lesson that echoes uneasily in our age of information manipulation and slander. Anne's ultimate tragedy may be that despite Henry's efforts to erase her, her death, not her life, became her most enduring legacy. In confronting the full horror of Anne Boleyn's execution, we face uncomfortable truths about power, gender, and the shaping of historical narratives. The sanitized version of her demise, the unfortunate queen meeting a swift and dignified end, serves to mask the systemic abuse of state power her case represents. By examining the psychological dimensions of her execution, the calculated torments, public humiliation, destruction of reputation, and attempted erasure of memory. We grasp not only Tudor justice, but also how authority is maintained through control of both bodies and narratives. In Anne's severed head, we find a warning about the fragility of truth itself before absolute power.